The story begins with a man sitting in a chair decorated with a red velvet cushion and a golden frame. On the armrest was a lion with blue diamond eyes, but the owner of the throne seemed to feel no affection for it. He slowly rose to his feet. His golden hair shone brighter than the sun at dawn. His transparent orange eyes, regular features like the work of the best sculptor of the century, and his chin, which combined firmness with softness, created an impression of unreal perfection. Everything about him screamed of the injustice that others called the will of the gods. Rosalind was unable to contain her inner tension. Her body reacted involuntarily as if to danger. She tried not to meet his gaze and answered briefly and formally. He asked her what she wanted, the ruler of the continent, the owner of a sword gifted by God himself. The one whose word decided the fate of empires wanted to hear her wish. She raised her eyes. His features were calm, his forehead smooth, his eyes soft, his lips unpressed. He was in a good mood. Rosalind hesitated. Part of her begged her to remain silent, but a decision that had been maturing in her for weeks had finally come to fruition. She took a deep breath. Remaining calm, she finally said that she wanted to resign as secretary. She asked for permission to leave. The emperor froze at first, then his face changed. His response was sharp. A hollow threat rang in his voice. Rosalind understood that he was angry. It was a feeling that was impossible to describe, but impossible to ignore. His words about death as the only way to be free sounded like a sentence. Her body froze, and her gaze froze. She didn't want to die. On the contrary, she wanted to live, which was why she had sacrificed herself by taking her brother's place 5 years ago. But the monarch was ruthless. He approached her and whispered the decisive words. And at that moment, Rosalind's last hope abandoned her. Rosalind Berith kept a secret that no one suspected. She knew that the world she lived in was not real. It was a novel. The thought first crossed her mind when she pondered the title of the book she was holding in her hands, The Tyrant's Tamed Heart. She closed the chapter and thought about the familiar details. She used to be an ordinary office worker. She worked for 6 years to support her family while her brothers were getting an education. On the day she finally allowed herself to live and handed in her resignation to her boss, everything changed. She was lying at home, bored, scrolling through her phone, not knowing how to fill the void. Rosalind signed up for a short story platform because a colleague often read something there. Then she came across a story about a tyrant who was trying to be changed by love. But she wasn't interested in the romantic storyline at all. What caught her attention most was the protagonist's attitude toward his secretaries. Their exhaustion, 3-day deadlines, and relentless demands were what really made her angry. She laughed, got angry, and even screamed into her pillow. She devoured the entire novel in one night and fell asleep when the morning light was already seeping through the blinds. When she woke up, everything felt foreign. The world around her was unfamiliar, as if she had switched to a different story. On the first day, she jumped out of the window. She hoped it was a dream, or at least that death would bring her back home, but she didn't even get a scratch. She tried again. Different methods, different risks. She played with poisonous plants, touched wild animals, and even tempted fate with bees. But none of her attempts worked. People considered her survival a miracle. But Rosalind understood. It just wasn't her time yet. And when her doubts disappeared, she stopped fighting. She looked around and only then noticed that she was living in luxury. She was loved, cared for, and given the best of everything. Her clothes, her room, her surroundings, everything screamed of care. Finally, she decided to accept her new reality. Gradually, she changed her attitude toward the world she found herself in. If she wasn't the heroine or the antagonist, then maybe there was a place for her here. 5 years passed. During this time, Rosalind completely got used to her new world. Her quick wit, flexible thinking, and ability to adapt allowed her to blend into society. She learned how to react appropriately. Rosalind spoke and lived in such a way that no one could even think she was a stranger here. It seemed that nothing could change that. She believed that it would always be this way. And that is what dulled her vigilance. She completely forgot who she was in the story. And her story did not end happily. One morning she overheard a conversation. Viscount Berrit was discussing the news with his brother. The Emperor was looking for a new secretary. The name Kahir sounded like an alarm bell to her. Something inside her snapped. Those words caused her to panic. Rosalind quickly ran to her room. She pulled a box from under her bed and opened it with a small key. She took out a worn book. Over the years, she had read it dozens of times, as if trying to find at least a hint of a clue. She turned the pages almost at random. Halfway through, there was no mention of herself. And then she suddenly saw her name. The lines were familiar, but this time the words struck her like never before. Because of Roy's fault, who couldn't organise the schedule properly, Kahir got angry. Unable to keep his promise to the main character, he ended up destroying Berit's entire family. Even Rosalind, who was well known in high society, did not escape retribution. Her hands froze, her face turned pale. The cold touched her neck like a warning. Death was not somewhere in the future. It was already standing next to her. And, worst of all, the reason seemed ridiculous. It wasn't her mistake, not the heroine, not the enemy. It was Roy's senseless negligence. She couldn't just give up like that. Over the years, the world had become her real home. Rosalind appreciated the little things. Desserts, comfort, loving parents, Roy, whom she scolded constantly but who always smiled back at her. All of this had become too precious to her to simply accept her fate. She put the book back in the box. She lay down under the blanket, staring at the flickering shadows of the canopy. Everything was too quiet, too real, and because of that, unbearable. She no longer wanted to die. The secretary still hadn't been found. Kahir's exhaustion had reached its limit. He slammed his fist on the table again. Cases were piling up at a frantic pace. Every day, dozens of important issues had to be resolved, and even the queue for an audience was not getting any shorter. Now there were even more people. He had just returned from the front. Kahir caught himself thinking that war was easier than ruling an empire. So he ordered that if a secretary was not found by tomorrow, the person looking for him would personally take on all his duties. It bordered on a threat. That same night, Derek arrived at Viscount Berith's estate. He paid no attention to the late hour. Etiquette was not important now. He had a pile of unfinished business, but visiting Berith was more important. The Viscount himself did not hide his surprise. His family was not among the most influential. There were many more talented candidates at the academy. But imperial rumours spread quickly. Even at the estate, they already knew about the new emperor, about the young victor who had earned the respect of the army through cruelty. And after the war, he had overthrown the old order by force. Stories of how he had removed the former empress frightened even the aristocrats. For the Viscount's gentle and kind nature, this was unacceptable. Hand his son over to such a man? He couldn't make up his mind. Roy was dear to him, but he was completely unsuited for such service. Gentle, simple and naive, he was more like a butterfly flying straight into a fire. Even if he wanted to, he wouldn't be able to survive alongside such a ruler. But Derek spoke calmly. His voice was restrained without any pressure, only fatigue. When he ran his finger around the cup, the Viscount couldn't help but feel sympathy. The boy was young but already broken by constant stress. Even so, the Viscount's decision remained unchanged. He couldn't sacrifice his son, not someone like Roy, and not to please an emperor whose shadow already loomed over the entire empire. The Viscount looked closely at Derek, his gaze a mixture of anxiety and fatigue. The young man was almost the same age as his son, and this similarity made the situation even more painful. He wanted to believe that there was another option, but Derek just shrugged wearily. He had been offered this option many times before, but always to no avail. Berith sighed heavily and pressed his palm to his forehead, as if trying to gather his thoughts. Then he slid it down his cheeks, wiping away the fatigue and despair. The decision had been made, and he voiced it quietly, without emotion. Derek wasted no time, taking a small box out of his pocket. Opening it, he revealed a round badge with a deer, the insignia of an imperial secretary. The Viscount's gaze froze, his face darkened, his lips tightened. The symbol in the box was confirmation. The order was final and indisputable. The Emperor had already made his decision. All that remained was to call his son. Berith bit his cheek again, glanced at the door and turned to the servant. After the butler left, the room was plunged into silence. The Viscount sat motionless, his eyes glancing toward Derek. Finally, he plucked up the courage to break the silence and asked the question that had been on his mind for so long. It was important for him to know what kind of person was behind the title. Derek glanced at his watch, then looked back at the Viscount in surprise. The latter immediately explained that he simply wanted to give his son some useful advice. However, Derek did not understand these parental concerns. If he had, he might have embellished the Emperor's portrait, if only out of sympathy. Instead, he began with the cold facts. Kahir does not forgive mistakes. He believes that only the flawless are worthy of being near him. One soldier who dozed off at his post was punished by being sent to the front lines. That was enough. The Viscount raised his hand sharply. His face paled, his lips trembled. Derek fell silent, disappointed. He liked talking about Kahir's coldness. It emphasized his own endurance. However, everyone who asked stopped listening. He stubbornly believed that everything would be fine if he didn't make any mistakes. It seemed logical to him. In a world where success was measured by results, there was no room for weakness. Derek glanced at his watch again, counting the minutes that were slipping away. Finally, there was a cautious knock at the door. When he heard it, Derek quickly stood up. His body felt lighter. Ahead of him lay a familiar routine, a routine meeting, and ultimately a division of responsibilities. There was even impatience in his movements, as if his body knew that things would be easier now. The door opened. The Viscount remained seated, staring at the floor. He hid his gaze, afraid that he would not be able to control his emotions when he saw his son. Derek's greeting sounded restrained, but in a moment, a surprised note appeared in his voice, and his face changed. The Viscount slowly turned his head and froze for a moment. Rosalind entered the room. Her precise, practiced curtsy immediately attracted attention. Rosalind moved confidently, like someone who had long since made up her mind. She spoke simply and clearly, saying that she would go in her brother's place. His daughter's words completely threw the Viscount off balance. At first, he asked her to repeat herself, thinking he had heard her wrong. But Rosalind confirmed that her decision was final. The Viscount's reaction was harsh. His body couldn't take the strain, and he fainted. The table fell over with him, and the room was suddenly in chaos. Servants rushed in, trying to restore order. Dishes were scattered, curtains were caught on chairs. In the commotion, only 2 people remained calm. Rosalind watched as her father was carried out of the hall, while Derek, without wasting a moment, handed her a small notebook, a concise guide to the duties of an imperial secretary. His face glowed with sincere admiration. This gesture, this sudden outburst of joy, caused Rosalind unexpected anxiety. A new path awaited her, and there was no turning back. As soon as she opened her eyes, the room was filled with voices. Everyone was talking at once. Her mother, father, brother, even the servants were crowding behind her. The feeling of sleep had not yet faded, but the pressure of reality was already enveloping her. Rosalind rubbed her eyelids, trying to understand what was happening. Every face bent over her was filled with anxiety, confusion, and despair. The words spoken the day before sounded too loud. It was as if the walls of the Barrett house had been torn down. The phrase that she would go in her brother's place had changed everything in an instant. Now both the Viscount and the Viscountess stood in her room at dawn, agitated and helpless. Roy looked at his sister with a guilty expression, his hands in his pockets, as if he didn't know where to put them. Her father tried to convince her with money. He said he had just invested in a mine and would soon be able to give her everything. His words echoed with hope that no longer existed. The investment was a mistake, and only she had the full picture. Rosalind had learned the truth when she saw the reference to Emperor Kahir in the novel. She reread the scenes several times, searching for details. The cruelty, the whims, the danger. It was all true, but there were also useful references. Among them was the story of the mine, which turned out to be fiction. In the novel, this mine became a trap that dragged her family into debt. Those who convinced the Viscount to invest disappeared, leaving behind only shattered hopes. She knew that Roy was only supposed to work for a week. It was a trial period, however, circumstances forced him to stay. Rosalind remembered well. After losing their money, the family had no choice. Working at the palace provided a steady income. And the family needed money, urgently. Rosalind had no intention of giving up. A new motive arose within her, to stay not just for Roy's sake but for her own, for the sake of a future that could still be saved. The Viscountess begged her daughter to stop. Her words did not sound judgmental, but rather a confused desire to give her daughter back her dream. She remembered the balls, the parties, the luxurious dresses, the status of a debutante. She was only 18 and could have been the pride of high society. Her mother begged her to come to her senses, write to the palace, and cancel everything before it was too late. But for Rosalind, it was already too late. She couldn't let a mistake with the mine ruin her entire family. There was no turning back. Her words were clear. She would work for the Emperor for only 5 years. The girl forced herself to come up with something convincing. She smiled, barely looking away, and gave her reason. She wanted to get married at 23. This age was not surprising. In the Empire of Aetius, girls made their debut at 18, lived freely until they were 20, and then accepted proposals. In noble families, everything was arranged, often from childhood. Roy did not argue. He knew there was no other way. Meanwhile, Derek stood before Cahir and briefly informed him that a new secretary would arrive today. This fact did not seem to interest the Emperor, until it was clarified that the secretary was from the Berit family, with no ties to the Empress and no involvement in palace intrigues. This was Cahir's main requirement. The Emperor's tone, however, was detached. He watched his advisor silently. Derek paused for a moment, involuntarily furrowing his brow. When he said that the new secretary would arrive today, Cahir remained cold. Derek adjusted the red cloak on his shoulders and asked if he needed his crown. It was not just a decoration, but a symbol of power, adorned with rare pink and blue diamonds. The Emperor nodded. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Derek reacted first, assuming that the new secretary had arrived. The Emperor sarcastically clarified that it was the person who would be correcting other people's mistakes. The advisor, who was offended, replied sharply, even addressing Cahir directly for the first time with a request not to dismiss the newcomer. His eyes were filled with fatigue, irony, and despair. He met the Emperor's gaze. Cahir just clicked his tongue and sat down in his chair. Derek gave the command, and the door opened. Rosalind stood in the doorway. Her figure immediately attracted attention. The Emperor frowned, not blinking, not trusting what he saw. His gaze quickly swept from head to toe. Her hair, wavy and light violet, was partially gathered, the rest falling to her thighs. Pale skin, clear blue eyes, a straight nose, bright lips, every feature was masterfully crafted. A yellow dress accentuated her waist, and the hem fell softly to the ground. She looked no less captivating than Cahir himself. The Emperor made little attempt to hide his irritation, his tone tense. He turned to Derek with a silent question. He simply said her name, Rosalind Berith, the new secretary. His voice rang with pride, as if he had just made a brilliant move. Rosalind stepped forward, the door closing behind her. She glanced around the office and curtsied confidently. Her voice sounded balanced. She introduced herself as a servant of the Son of the Empire. When Derek confirmed that the new secretary was a woman, Cahir immediately stood up. His movements were smooth but restrainedly rigid. He approached Rosalind not to greet her, but simply to stand very close to her. The space between them seemed to thicken. Rosalind reflexively inhaled. He exuded a coldness, not physical, but the kind that arises in moments of complete alienation. She looked up. Cahir stared at her silently, his expression hard and merciless. She remembered a description from the book that had previously seemed comical. Now it made her tremble. If she hadn't known that it wasn't time to die yet, she might have actually started begging for mercy. His voice was short and clear. He didn't like women. Both Derek and Rosalind looked at each other in surprise at this statement. She knew much more about him than she should have. At least that's what she thought. Her facial expression was not restrained, although she did not respond with words. Cahir looked at her again, now with a hint of irritation. He accused her of looking at him too openly. It was unexpected and pointless. He seemed to perceive her gaze as an intrusion. Rosalind probably just didn't hide her confusion, but the Emperor interpreted it differently. The order was clear. Send her back and check Berith's family immediately. He had already made up his mind. No explanations, no interest in her words or her origins. Rosalind imagined the consequences. Thorough investigation, exposure, punishment. Scenarios quickly flashed through her mind. Even the prospect of slavery seemed more real than salvation. For the first time that day, she lost her usual confidence. The smile disappeared from her face, but escape was impossible. She was already standing there, and, gathering her strength, she turned to him calmly. Her tone remained restrained. She did not justify herself, but simply suggested that he explain what exactly was wrong with her. If the situation demanded it, she would accept his decision. Rosalind believed she could convince Kahir. She knew his tastes well, and this time she had made every effort to satisfy each and every one of them. She decided to try talking to him. Her voice sounded calm, even though she was tense inside. Kahir looked away from the mirror for a moment, glanced at Rosalind again, then took a deep breath. He finally spoke. His answer surprised both Rosalind and Derek. What he said made them exchange surprised glances. She didn't know whether to be happy that all her plans were falling apart. Rosalind knew that Kahir sometimes behaved unpredictably, but she didn't expect this reason. After all, the other heroine, Ella, was also considered beautiful, and that didn't bother him at all. So why does it bother him now? There was nothing like this in the book. On the contrary, all his affections had clearly defined criteria which she had strictly adhered to today. Her hairstyle, makeup, clothes, everything had been chosen down to the smallest detail. And now it was all for nothing. Rosalind tried to control her emotions and quickly thought about what to say next. She felt that the situation was reaching a critical point, and it seemed that the plot of the novel was not going according to plan. She had no intention of giving up. Taking a deep breath, she turned to Kahir, trying to convince him of his own greatness. It was a difficult conversation. She had to squeeze the compliments out of herself. Derek gestured to her to keep talking, not to stop. It was difficult for her to think of anything else to say other than praise for his appearance. His other traits were not particularly admirable, and she couldn't praise him for his cruelty, stubbornness, and military ambitions. Despite everything, she managed to maintain her dignity and say exactly what Kahir wanted to hear. Gradually, his expression changed, and his eyebrows relaxed. It was a good sign. When he asked a direct question, Rosalind straightened up and answered with confidence. Her image of a shadow following the sun sounded sincere. She nodded without looking away. There was a pause, and Kahir kept his eyes on her. He seemed to be hesitating, but the previous tension was no longer apparent in his behaviour. Rosalind realised that it was time to make her move. In her world, self-presentation was important, especially in the 21st century, where the ability to talk about oneself opened many doors. She decided to act confidently. Focused but smiling, she began to list her skills: fluency in foreign languages, high endurance, ability to adapt to requirements and expectations. Her words were chosen carefully, confidently, without hesitation. Rosalind wanted to convey that she could not only fulfill the position but also suit the Emperor's tastes. Kahir changed his posture. His reaction was restrained but eloquent. The girl saw a slight interest in his gaze. Something in her words caught his attention. In response, she smiled even wider to reinforce the impression. When Kahir repeated her words with a hint, there was a sense of playfulness in him. He seemed to be testing how far she was willing to go, and Rosalind did not falter. She remained calm and firm in her intention. Everything about her spoke of her readiness to prove her worth. The Emperor leaned back in his throne, settled himself more comfortably, and looked at her intently again. His gaze seemed penetrating, but it no longer made her feel uneasy, and a hint of satisfaction appeared in her posture. He weighed the pros and cons, but was leaning toward a positive decision. Without taking his eyes off Rosalind, Kahir briefly addressed Derek. He immediately approached, and in a moment everything was decided. The room next to the Emperor's was now hers. This meant one thing: she had officially become part of the palace. The life of a court secretary was never easy. The work schedule stretched from dawn to late at night, and any delay could be costly. Kahir's mood changed instantly. Derek remembered this well and looked at his new colleague with some trepidation. The Emperor gave her a week to prove herself. It was both a chance and a test. Rosalind accepted the challenge without hesitation. She bowed gracefully, smiling as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. And Kahir couldn't take his eyes off her lavender hair, which fell softly on her shoulders. Derek dared to ask a question. Kahir stopped and nodded slightly, allowing him to speak. The question was personal. too unusual for their daily business. The advisor wanted to know if the emperor really hated women. Kahi did not deny it, but added that he only hated beautiful ones. The reason remained unclear. Even Derek, who had known him since childhood, had never heard such an explanation before. He did not hide his surprise when Kahir mentioned Rosalind, saying that she was too beautiful and that made him wary. The conversation came to a standstill. Derek tried to understand what exactly made Kahir uncomfortable. After all, he had always appreciated beautiful things, from clothes to furniture. But this time, the emperor said something different. He admitted in a barely audible voice that the girl was perfect for his tastes. That was what frightened him the most. Before entering the chambers, Kahi gave one more order. The emperor ordered a second check of Berith's family to rule out even the slightest connection to the former empress. He did not believe in coincidences, especially when it came to his own preferences. Rosalind stopped, lifting her skirt slightly to show her high-heeled shoes. For the first time, she truly understood why maids chose flat shoes. All this time, the girl had no idea how much she would have to walk while working as the emperor's secretary. She had to move around at least as much as the maids, if not more. Hui looked around, her gaze darting anxiously. Seeing Rosalind's shoes, she rubbed her cheek in confusion, not knowing what to do. They were supposed to go to the main palace, but instead found themselves in the garden behind it, which belonged to the third. The architecture of Eteus consisted of a main building, the first and second palaces on either side, and the third at the rear. Traditionally, the first palace was occupied by the current empress, the second by the former empress, and the third by the emperor's favourites. But in reality, everything was decided not by formality, but by the ruler's favour. It was she who gave influence and power to the inhabitants of the palaces. Hui spoke quietly, quickly, constantly looking around. She urged them to go a little further, promising that the library would be a more comfortable place to rest than the garden. Rosalind couldn't help but notice the tension in her words. This alarmed her, especially in combination with the place where they found themselves. Rosalind tried to remember why the third palace made her feel uneasy. The memory came to her suddenly. The empress had once lived here. Kahi's mother was his most dangerous enemy. She was the one who had once brought her son to the brink of death. The people did not simply call her cruel. Some considered her the embodiment of evil itself. The wisest thing people could do was to stay as far away from that place as possible. Any unnecessary attention from the residents of the third palace was dangerous, like a noose around your neck. And just then, a figure appeared in exquisite attire, whose face Rosalind had never seen before, but she recognized immediately by her demeanor. Standing before them was the former empress. She noticed her companions and stopped. Her gaze fell on Rosalind. The woman's face changed. Something disturbing flashed in her smile. She did not hide her surprise. Something about her appearance aroused her interest, perhaps a resemblance to her son's tastes. Her gaze became piercing, and her questions direct. She wanted to know the girl's name and origin, and when she introduced herself, the empress immediately asked about the Berit family, who stood behind their surname. The Berit family could not compete with the influential duchies, but it had an unblemished reputation. Education, loyalty to the crown, and honesty were its unchanging values. Rosalind had grown up proud of her origins, so Azella's cold question struck her. She knew well the warm hearts of her relatives who, although not wealthy, remained worthy of respect. In fact, the Berit dynasty was a family of artists who had been creating literature and art for over 200 years. These words were partly new to Rosalind, as she was not well versed in her family history. However, Azel did not hide her mockery. For her, it was just a fallen family clinging to memories. No influence, no estates, no titles, just words about the past. Rosalind shuddered inwardly. An insult ran down her spine, but she did not allow herself to show any emotion or make any sharp retorts. She lowered her eyes, took a deep breath, and smiled. Her words sounded calm. The Berit family had nothing to do with the Bel-Luas family, to which the Empress Mother belonged. Such fame could not stand the test of time, and that, she said, was what made Rosalind feel sorry for them. Azel couldn't help herself and asked about the title. She was ready to explode, but held back. Her anger broke through the mask of a smile which hid her open hostility. She wasn't asking out of curiosity. Her goal was to humiliate her. Rosalind did not answer right away. She could see that Azel wanted to make her slip up, but when she finally spoke, her voice was calm. She was the Emperor's secretary. That was enough to make the Empress's mood sour. Azel did not believe it was true. She decided that the girl had allowed herself to ignore Kahir's mother, but every word she said was a distortion of the truth. Rosalind, who was usually able to control her facial expressions, could not hide her emotions. Her smile disappeared. She remained silent because any word could become a trap. Azela was already hinting at punishment, and it sounded like a threat wrapped in concern. In the palace, a few corridors away, Kahir stood up abruptly when he heard the scream. At first, he was going to ignore the commotion, but after Derek's words, he sat up straighter. When he heard Rosalind's name, his face changed. The secretary he had appointed himself had fallen into Azel's hands. That was how the report sounded. Derek understood what meetings with Azel meant for others. Anxiety grew inside him. Rosalind might not return, and if she ran away, that would be half the trouble. It would be much worse to lose her for good. Kahir suddenly remembered Rosalind. He imagined Azel pulling strands of her rare light purple hair, her yellow dress crumpling, her delicate face contorted with rage. Curiosity urged him to find out what was going on, but he also did not want to see Rosalind in such a helpless state. Sighing, he decided that he would somehow thank all three of them for interfering with his peace. Meanwhile, in the hall, Rosalind was forced to bow her head before the Queen Mother. Her voice sounded polite but bitter. Her expression changed and her clear gaze became sharp as a sickle. She could not stand humiliation, especially from those who disregarded human dignity. The words she uttered were a challenge, albeit within the bounds of formal etiquette. Rosalind firmly reminded her of the unacceptability of insinuating the Queen Mother's love for her son. There was nothing rude in her words, but their very meaning caused Azel to lose her composure. Her voice trembled. She tried to answer, but instead began to scream. Her anger, which she no longer held back, became dangerous. Azel raised her hand, but Rosalind did not look away. She knew she had crossed the line, but she could not remain silent when it came to Kahir's pain. She closed her eyes, preparing for the blow. But instead of pain, she heard a cry. Hui's voice cut through the tense silence. A tall man with golden hair appeared before Rosalind. His broad back blocked her view and his strong hand held Azel's wrist firmly. His crown had slipped slightly, but that did not diminish his power. Kahir confidently confirmed that his secretary had not said anything wrong. His words were clear and unwavering. Azela couldn't contain her indignation. Her face contorted, and she tried to pull her hand away. But Kahir squeezed her wrist even tighter. Her short moan betrayed her pain, but he did not let go. His tone remained calm even when Azela's voice rang with anger. The Empress tried to shift the blame to Rosalind, but instead saw Kahir's eyes flash red. He called his secretary by name and she answered immediately, collected, and without a hint of hesitation. Her calmness contrasted with the general tension in the room. The moment Kahir intervened, grabbing Azela by the arm, Rosalind felt genuine support. All eyes turned to the girl when she spoke. Her voice sounded confident. Derek frowned, and the Queen Mother herself gave her a look that seemed to beg her to remain silent. But Rosalind had already begun. Without reproach, calmly, she began to speak. The Queen's words, which spoke of maternal tenderness, hardly corresponded to the nature of her relationship with Kahir. There was nothing offensive about it. Just an observation. There was a restrained chuckle in the hall. It seemed that Kahir not only had no intention of punishing Rosalind, he intended to emphasize his support even more. His actions left Azela no choice. His appearance alongside the Empress, with whom he was rumored to have a complicated relationship, was telling. He looked at Azela with a slight sneer. His smile did not hide his true feelings. Azela's tone changed, but she did not finish her sentence and turned away. Her maids rushed to her, but she pushed their hands away. Kahir walked forward quickly and confidently, followed by Derek, Rosalind and Hui. They had already left behind the noisy third-star palace, where Azel's anger continued to rage. It was expected that this storm would last for several more days. As he walked along the road leading to the Imperial Palace, Kahir suddenly stopped. He looked back, and his gaze fell on Rosalind. Something in his eyes made her tense before he even spoke. The question seemed to threaten to destroy the delicate balance that had existed between them until now. She responded in her usual tone, trying to maintain a smile that was more like a mask. She spoke of her devotion, her desire to learn, to serve, to be close to the one she considered a genius. But Kahir interrupted her abruptly and unceremoniously. He dismissed the formalities, swept the crown from his head. It almost fell, but he caught it and threw it straight at Rosalind. She barely managed to catch it. The crown was not just heavy, it was excessively heavy, adorned with countless priceless jewels. Her fingers clenched the metal and stones tightly, as if that could protect her. Kahir's gaze was dangerous. Even without a weapon, he knew how to create such tension that it became difficult to breathe. Rosalind felt that one more word of untruth, and it could all be over. Derek, intrigued, came closer. He also wanted to hear the answer. Then she confessed that she had not come of her own free will, but in place of her brother. Her words made Kehi laugh. His laughter was loud, uncontrolled, almost contemptuous. Derek just sighed. Rosalind stood silently, feeling her confidence melt away with every passing second. Kahir's laughter was worse than anger. She forced herself to smile again. She said she was ready to answer any questions because she was a servant. Kahir did not answer right away. He took a step forward. His shadow fell across her face. He repeated the question, and she lied again, this time more quietly. She said her brother hadn't come because he was ill. This time there was no laughter. Kahir silently closed the distance between them. His eyes flashed with menace again. He didn't need her lies. He saw right through her. Rosalind felt she was losing control of her body. Lying was easier than telling the truth. But now even that lie was useless. Her brother wasn't sick. He just didn't dare. And now she was here instead of him. Rosalind lowered her gaze. Her eyelashes cast shadows on her cheeks, and this did not go unnoticed by Kahir. He understood that the reason for her hesitation lay deeper than it seemed. There was something personal in this silence. And although logic told him to give her space, his curiosity proved stronger. He ordered Derek and Hui to leave. Neither of them hid their surprise. For Derek, it was particularly unpleasant. He had risked his life fighting Azel, and the Emperor had never once defended or supported him. And now, here was a quiet, unknown secretary. The feeling of contempt was almost physical. Kahir turned back to Rosalind, hinting that the time for hesitation was over. She knew that those standing nearby would not hear her words, but her lips could betray more than they should. She tried to focus, but the pressure with which he approached only intensified her inner tension. The distance between them disappeared. It became difficult to breathe. The Emperor's eyes widened as she leaned so close to him that their shadows merged. Her lips touched his ear. Kahir's body froze, as if burned. He was not used to such gestures. Since childhood, he had been treated as unapproachable. Physical contact without permission was considered insolence. But now he didn't react. She whispered a reply and immediately stepped back. It all lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to change his mood. Rosalind had crossed a line that no one had dared to cross before. And instead of indignation, Kahir suddenly laughed. It was loud, uncontrollable laughter. He doubled over, clutching his stomach as if something had genuinely amused him. For a moment, there was a feeling of lightness in the air. Rosalind stood silently. The girl didn't know if it was a success or just a pause before disaster. When Kahir finally straightened up, he announced that she would remain his secretary. He was intrigued, and that was decisive. Her unpredictability awakened a thrill in him. He held out his hand. Rosalind paused for a moment, staring at his palm. There was a challenge in this gesture. If she took his hand, there would be no turning back. She knew it was only the beginning. A tough, ambiguous, sometimes dangerous life alongside the power that held the Empire together. But she didn't hesitate. It was part of her plan. Rosalind took his hand. Her body reacted instantly. The coldness of his touch ran through her skin, but she remained calm. The question of how he had understood her lie was asked without emotion, and Kahir responded with action. He pulled Rosalind closer. Her body arched involuntarily, but she couldn't break free. His hand held her waist firmly. His face came closer. He explained quietly that she had betrayed herself with her facial expressions. Her habit of biting her lip when she lied was too obvious. Besides, she had almost embarrassed herself because of the bird on her first day at work. His remark had a hidden meaning, but it was not meant as punishment. Rosalind tried to pull away. She felt his tense muscles under her fingers, but Kahir wouldn't let her go. All she could do was maintain her dignity. She bowed, still in his embrace. His smile fell on her forehead. After a short pause, he announced her first task, to describe his achievements in the Japanese-Chinese War. She had one day. Meanwhile, a few steps away, Hui leaned toward Derek. Both watched silently. One of them suggested that something was starting between Kahi and Rosalind. Derek responded cautiously. He had noticed it too. The spark was already smouldering. Derek stroked Hui's face. He looked a little dishevelled, his hair tousled and his shirt wrinkled. 5 years had passed since Rosalind became Kahi's secretary, and much had changed. During that time, Derek and Hui had grown closer, and now it seemed as if the echoes of that long-ago spark between the Emperor and his secretary had been passed on to them. Derek leaned over, brushed a strand of hair from Hui's neck, and gently touched her skin with his lips. She shuddered, remembering how similar this situation had been before. Her voice dropped to a whisper, but her words were tense. She remembered Rosalind, the woman who had had no romances or attachments all these years, only her work. And there was something in her tone that sounded like a reproach, directed not only at Derek, but also at herself. Over time, Rosalind began to take on some of Derek's responsibilities. This gave him the opportunity to step back, take a break, and feel freer. That was when his feelings for Hui began. They were united by their unwillingness to burden themselves with unnecessary things. Neither of them wanted excessive responsibility, but Hui did not agree with this view. She insisted that it was only because Rosalind hadn't yet taken on other responsibilities that they had time for each other. It wasn't because they were easygoing, but rather because someone was constantly sacrificing themselves. When Derek asked her what she meant, Hui became nervous. Her voice was filled with despair. She started talking about Rosalind, frightened by the thought that she would be alone forever, without a lover. The advisor listened. He had never been particularly concerned about Rosalind. He considered her reliable, even a convenient foundation on which everything rested. Sometimes he thought there was something of Kahir in her actions. The same precision, severity, silent determination, but nothing more. Hui continued. There was no exaggeration in her words, only accumulated pain. She listed the names people called Rosalind behind her back. She was a workhorse, an emotionless workaholic, His Majesty's shadow and a doll without desires. She ended with an emotional outburst. Her tears were real. Hui couldn't think about it calmly, especially that Rosalind would live her life alone, devoted entirely to her work. In 5 years, everything had changed. Life had taken a different turn, and Rosalind had managed to stay on this difficult path. Her brother Roy got married and had a child. The problem with the ownership of the estate was resolved without conflict, and the family lived peacefully. They even moved to the capital to be closer to her. After all, Rosalind hardly ever left the palace. She was always with Kahi. She sat at her desk in her study, leafing through a familiar novel. It was the same story that had started it all. According to the book, the main character, Ella, should have appeared long ago. She was supposed to be the one Kahir would fall in love with, but that didn't happen. A year had passed since she was supposed to appear in the story. Nothing happened on the Emperor's birthday. Rosalind began to doubt whether Ella even existed in this world. In the middle of the table stood a lion ornament. Its eyes, encrusted with red stones, reminded her of Kahir's gaze. She covered them with a sheet of paper, trying to shield herself from the intrusive feeling that someone was constantly watching her. On one sheet, she began to write down the main events from the book, and, on another, the deviations from the original plot. She started with the obvious. Instead of Roy, she became the secretary. A decision that once seemed temporary had become her reality for years. Her fatigue was becoming more and more noticeable, but it was too late to back down. The date of the next holiday was approaching. There had been no banquets in the palace since last year. After the Emperor's last birthday, no celebrations had been held. Rosalind rose from the table, the sudden movement echoing in her chest. She decided it was time to change the course of events. The plan was simple: organize a ball and thus provoke Ella's appearance, even if Kahir didn't want it. Meanwhile, the Emperor was already up. He had time to wash and change. Rosalind entered the chambers and, according to her duties, prepared the crown. She greeted him politely and suggested adding a bath in the hot springs to his schedule. He did not reject the idea. On the contrary, he looked pleased. She had chosen the right moment. In the warm water, when the body is relaxed, it would be possible to bring up the subject of the banquet. Stepping behind him, Rosalind leaned against the back of the chair. Both she and Kahir were reflected in the mirror. Their reflection briefly attracted the attention of the servants. Someone whispered a few words, assessing their appearance and their obvious, though never spoken, closeness. Hui, hearing these words, stepped on the foot of one of the maids, forcing her to be quiet. She felt a little better. She wasn't the only one who saw that there was something between these two. Tension reigned in the conference hall, where the noble lords soon gathered. Everyone sat silently, not daring to break the silence. Everyone in power understood that any word could cost them dearly. The Emperor had not yet appeared, but his very presence in the palace could be felt in every corner. Marquis Su rushed forward and found himself on his knees before the throne. His forehead hit the marble floor, leaving dark spots of blood on it. Silence fell over the hall. Kahir watched everything without emotion, as if weighing not the act itself, but how the Marquis was trying to avoid the consequences. The confession was clear: treason, passing information to the enemy, greed. The Emperor did not deny the obvious. Such crimes were punishable by death. His answer was short, his decision final, but the Marquis's gaze, full of fear and hope, suddenly turned to Rosalind. She was not surprised. She knew what would happen. The day before she had warned him, if he wanted to save himself, he must not only confess, but also return what he had obtained by deception and renounce part of his lands. And most importantly, he must not make a scene. However, the Marquis complied with only one point, disregarding the rest. And now he was on the brink of disaster. When Kahir drew his sword, everyone understood that this was not a threat. He intended to kill him right then and there without hesitation. One step and it would all be over. But at the last moment, Rosalind stepped forward. Kahir froze, the blade suspended in mid-air, waiting for an explanation. The secretary acknowledged the gravity of the crime, but she pointed out that death was too quick a punishment. It did not cleanse or restore justice. The Empire needed compensation, not a corpse. She offered to take everything: property, land, influence, and leave only the title, stripped of any real meaning. Humiliation of this level had to be long-lasting, not instantaneous. Kahir understood everything. No explanations were necessary. He agreed, silently but confidently. The Marquis stood on his knees, unable to say anything. His face remained downcast, his fist pressed against his mouth. He did not utter a word, but the thought he so wanted to shout out was obvious. Meanwhile, the Marquis clenched his fist and put it in his mouth, swallowing the words, "Just kill me." Only two people remained in the meeting room: Rosalind and Kahir. Everyone else had long since left. Unfinished documents still lay on the table: reports, orders, draft resolutions. Rosalind decided to finish everything on the spot instead of taking the work back to her office. Kahir, although he could have left, stayed. His signature was needed, as was the seal. No paper was valid without it. He sat quietly, unhurried, just watching. It looked unusual, a ruler waiting for his secretary to finish her work. When he spoke to her again, she looked up. His smile, familiar and repeated lately, reappeared on his face. She thought he was smiling on purpose, for no reason, just to get a reaction. That smile made her uneasy. She knew his routine, his habits, even his reactions, but she was beginning to realize that she didn't really know him as a person. Lately, something else had been bothering her. She was finding herself increasingly attracted to Kahir. His remark about a new war only confirmed it. He was bored. She knew that this was the greatest threat. Only 4 months had passed since the last military campaign. It had been short, with almost no casualties, but the consequences had not yet been resolved. And now he was hinting at another one. Rosalind assumed he was unwell. She recognized the signs. She suggested he take a rest. Kahir went to his private bath. Its walls and floor were decorated with golden tiles. While he bathed, Rosalind remained in the lounge. She tried not to think about her fatigue, but her thoughts stubbornly returned to something else. She was concerned about how Kahir's behavior had changed. He had become too physical. Rosaline was also worried about whether the main character would show up. She needed to organize the ball as soon as possible so that something would finally happen between Kahir and Ella. Her thoughts were interrupted by Kahir. He appeared unexpectedly and asked what she was thinking about. Rosaline replied briefly and evasively, then looked away, realizing how attractive he looked at that moment. Kahir sat down next to her, still damp from his hot bath. Focusing on her duties, she handed him a tray with a cup of restorative tea. Rosaline voiced her request to organize a festive banquet in honor of the Empress's birthday next month. Her voice was even, her expression restrained, as if it were of no particular importance. Kahir, who was just about to take his cup, froze. His gaze slid toward Rosaline. She held her breath. She knew the question might provoke a reaction. And she was right. His reaction was restrainedly irritated. He reminded her that no one had celebrated the Empress's birthday for 5 years, let alone held a banquet. Rosaline smiled, trying to ease the tension. She cautiously hinted that one of the families that supported the Empress had recently been destroyed on Kahir's initiative. He immediately remembered. It was the Marquis Sue. He remembered the sword and how Rosaline had stopped him back then. His face darkened. But she quickly took the initiative, explaining that mercy for the Marquis could bring strategic benefits. He would be used to expose other spies, and the very fact of the Emperor's mercy would improve his image among the aristocracy. In addition, it would cause concern for the Queen Mother, which would play into their hands. Kahir listened silently, his expression indifferent, which actually meant agreement. He was familiar with Rosaline's ability to intervene at the right moment and steer events in a favourable direction. Kahir took a sip of tea. His voice sounded low, a little tired. He hated banquet evenings. The fake smiles, the meaningless conversations, the empty toasts. However, he did not object. If Rosaline decided it was best, then she must have her reasons. Besides, she had his permission to act as she saw fit. They worked late into the night. The documents that needed to be checked seemed endless. Only when Rosaline coughed and accidentally hit her forehead on the table did the three of them finally take a break. Kahir announced that they had done enough for the day. Rosaline noticed out of the corner of her eye how Derek's face changed. He didn't hide his relief. She could have guessed without a doubt that instead of going to his room, he would go to Hui's. Derek wasted no time and was the first to leave the room. Kahir lingered at the door, looked back, and asked if she was leaving too. Rosaline replied that she had a few things to finish up. Kahir approached her, and the atmosphere between them became tense, although there was no obvious reason for it. He asked if there was anything else that needed to be done urgently, or if it would be better to leave it until morning. Rosaline leaned over the table, looking through documents, trying not to miss anything. But she misjudged her movement and cut her finger on the edge of a sheet of paper. The pain was sharp and unexpected. She sighed in frustration as she looked at the thin trickle of blood. She unconsciously pursed her lips, trying to suck her finger into her mouth, but he stopped her. Kahir quietly said her name and caught her hand. She was slightly taken aback. His touch was unexpected. He looked at her hand, small, neat, a little tired, but nimble. He was surprised by its fragility. It was with these hands that she kept the chaos of imperial affairs under control every day. Kahir felt a sudden dissatisfaction, more with himself than with her. He realized that he didn't know as much about her as he thought he did. The thought bothered him. Rosaline withdrew her hand, and he held his breath for a moment, pressing his lips together. The Emperor, who had returned to the room, glanced at his watch and said that she should go and rest. Kahir remembered the delegation from Queensbury that was due to arrive the next day. Rosaline replied that he shouldn't worry about her sleep. She was full of energy and didn't think that a late night would interfere with her preparations. Her words did not sit well with Kahir. His irritation was obvious. He wanted to remind her about her health and that working without rest could be dangerous. But instead, she responded in a way that made his words seem meaningless, and he felt disrespected. Tension hung between them. He watched Rosaline, who paid no attention to his gaze. The Emperor heard his own heart beating faster as he tried to understand what was going on between them. She seemed less understandable to him than before. When Rosaline later lay down on her bed, her thoughts would not leave her. She could not get Kahir's face out of her head. His expression that evening had been unusual, subdued with a hint of disappointment. She tried to remember when things had changed between them. Not long ago, she had been his indispensable assistant, but now she increasingly felt that he was losing touch with her. Recalling his expression, Rosalind realized that he had indeed changed. She was surprised that she hadn't noticed it before. His moods had become changeable, and he was increasingly silent. At times he didn't seem to know how to behave around her. The next day he did something that surprised her even more. He suddenly took her by the wrist and led her through the palace corridors, cancelling all her tasks for the day. He took her to his bedroom and insisted that she rest, even though she had no intention of going to sleep. Rosalind found herself in bed, forced to obey his decision. Her thoughts were constantly on Kahir. Rosalind tried to calm herself, but she couldn't. She could still feel the warmth of his touch, even though she tried to forget it. That night, she couldn't sleep, her thoughts constantly returning to him. Exhausted, the secretary still couldn't make sense of what was happening between them. Kahir looked at her exhausted face with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. He just clicked his tongue quietly and shook his head, but there was no sign of his usual anger. It had become part of their new rhythm. Kahir often appeared suddenly when she was working late into the night. Then he would force her to go to bed despite her protests. She obeyed, though she couldn't understand why it had become so important to him. Despite everything, Rosalind continued to work on organising the banquet. Derek seemed to be unable to cope with the workload, but Rosalind, as always, helped silently. Thanks to her diligence, the preparations went ahead without a hitch. However, one day, Kahir, noticing her fatigue, couldn't take it anymore. He shouted at her not to exhaust herself for the Queen, and to stop immediately. Kahir was irritated. He stood up, turned abruptly, and without looking back, ordered Rosalind and Derek not to follow him. They stood there, not understanding what had happened, rubbing the backs of their heads, trying to figure out what was wrong. Rosalind wondered, slightly agitated, if she had done something wrong. But Derek just shrugged, looking just as confused. Rosalind figured that the Emperor was probably exhausted. She couldn't imagine what could have caused such a reaction. After all, she had worked hard to prepare everything for the celebration, and she didn't know that Kahir hated banquets. Maybe it wasn't just that. Rosalind stood in front of the mirror. Her secretary carefully applied her makeup and smoothed her hair when suddenly she remembered the angry Kahir. His words still echoed in her head, and she remembered how he had told her not to worry too much about the preparations. But she couldn't help it. It was her job, and she did it diligently. Rosalind thought she looked a little better and that today, the Empress's birthday, would be special. Meanwhile, Kahir leaned back on the sofa and watched the servants. He was tapping his fingers, clearly dissatisfied, and Rosalind felt the air around them grow cold. There was little time left before the banquet began, and she hurried to finish her final checks. Her heart was beating faster because she was afraid she might have missed something. But Kahir would not leave her alone. He finally interrupted her thoughts, expressing his disagreement with the choice of colour for the dress. He pointed to the yellow colour and immediately changing his mind, said that he liked the purple dress better. Hearing this, Rosalind couldn't take it anymore and turned to him, asking what exactly he was doing. Kahir replied that he wanted her to look her best and wouldn't let her refuse his help, even if she didn't have time for it. He literally forced the maids to present the purple dress. Rosalind realised that arguing with her boss was useless, so she turned to Huai and asked what was going on. The girl sighed slightly and explained that he was choosing her clothes. The secretary was shocked. She didn't understand why this was such a problem. She asked what was wrong with her dress, which was a simple freesia colour with no frills, narrow sleeves, and a short length so she could move around. It was a dress she had ordered 3 years ago so she could work comfortably. Hui, without answering directly, looked her up and down, then shrugged silently, as if to say it wasn't right for such an occasion. Rosalind realised that to them, her clothes were too simple for the event. She wondered for a moment why it was so important to them, but immediately felt that it was better to leave those thoughts for later. The secretary, looking at her outfit, suddenly realised that the clothes she had chosen to prepare for the holiday were completely inappropriate for a banquet. She always wore them on such occasions, but it was not at all the style that was appropriate for a formal event. She was Kahira's secretary, and that required a certain level of restraint in her appearance, although in reality, a luxurious dress would have been entirely appropriate. Hui, as if reading her thoughts, calmly explained that Rosalind would have to dance with His Majesty that evening. Rosalind couldn't believe her ears. At first, she thought it was some kind of mistake, but Hui remained adamant, trying not to show any emotion. At the imperial birthday celebration, everyone danced with a partner. There was no doubt that Kahir needed a partner for this dance, and if he was choosing a dress for her right now, it could only mean one thing. Rosalind smiled nervously, her mind racing for excuses. She tried to understand what this meant for her. She remembered how she hadn't danced at Kahir's birthday last year. However, Hui quickly explained that that day was dedicated to His Majesty, and today's celebration was the Empress's birthday. Therefore, there was no reason why His Majesty should not dance. Rosalind felt her mind become even more confused. It was difficult for her to imagine herself as Kahir's partner, and even more difficult to imagine how they would look together at such a solemn event. Her inner voice panicked, imagining the consequences of such a dance. It would have serious consequences for her, especially if Ella, another important figure at the celebration, saw her next to Kahir. But he, ignoring her confusion, approached Rosalind. Then he placed a purple dress in her hands. He said that she would look no less beautiful than him in this dress, and that clothes were wings that gave a person strength. Rosalind was confused. She felt that she had not yet finished what she had come to do, but Kahir immediately showed his irritation and ordered her to put on the dress immediately. He turned away, taking off his shirt, and asked her to leave so he could change. The room was filled with an awkward silence. The maids watching them noticed the tension between them, even though no one expressed their thoughts openly. Kahir, with a smile in his voice, said to Rosalind that if she was going to stand there, he couldn't continue getting changed. Rosalind blushed instantly, gathered herself, and hurried out of the room. As she left, she said goodbye and promised to see him at the banquet. Finally, the celebration began. The hall was full of elegance and refinement. The light was not bright, but every ray emphasized the luxury of the interior. Rare delicacies from abroad were displayed on the tables, and exclusive tableware added even more solemnity to the celebration. The emperor sat on his throne, looking around the hall, and felt how seriously this banquet annoyed him. He was waiting for Rosalind. She was not there, and this upset him. The Empress noticed that Kahir was not enjoying himself at all. His Highness thought with dissatisfaction that he seemed to be the only one at the banquet who was not enjoying the moment. He wondered where Rosalind could be and why she was so late. The secretary was rushing to the party. She felt she was late and worried that Kahir was probably already looking for her. Thoughts of how angry he might be because of her absence ran through her mind. But suddenly, her gaze fell on a woman who appeared among the guests. She had golden hair, pale skin, eyes like spring greenery, and a snub nose. All the features of her face gave her a delicate appearance. Her slim waist and elegant movements reminded her of a faun. It was Ella, the perfect copy of the main character from the novel that Rosalind had so often imagined. Rosalind felt pleasantly surprised. She couldn't help but admire her. Finally, Ella had appeared in real life, but her surprise quickly turned to embarrassment. Ella, seeing Rosalind, only glanced at her briefly. Then she turned away abruptly and walked on. This gesture puzzled Rosalind, and a question arose in her mind. Was it hostility? She couldn't understand why Ella looked like she didn't want to see her. Rosalind hurried on, trying to forget her uncertainty. Her thoughts revolved around Ella, this stranger who so easily attracted attention and whom Kahir was supposed to meet. She asked herself again why Ella had looked at her so coldly and whether it really mattered. Now was not the time for trivialities. She had to hurry, or she would be even later. Kahir was probably waiting for her, and that did not bode well. The hall was already quite crowded, and the emperor felt very uncomfortable among the guests. His gaze was absent. He just sat on the throne. The emperor rested his chin on his hand, watching the time pass. Azel turned to him and suggested that he get up before the dance song began. She asked if he wanted to stretch his legs instead of sitting there looking disinterested. However, Kahir just waved her away. He did not answer, but only added quietly that his partner had not yet arrived. The Empress just shrugged and smiled slightly, asking if there really was a rule that required him to dance with someone specific. There was a question in her words, but Kahir did not answer. He could never be sure of anything, even when it came to something as simple as dancing. She was thinking about this when Ella appeared on the horizon. Her appearance caught the attention of all the guests. Azel took the opportunity to introduce her to Kahi. Ella, like a bright light in the dark crowd, radiated charm and calm, making everyone focus only on her. Her luxurious pink dress and graceful gait further emphasized her elegance. Kagira wasted no time in meeting her gaze. At that moment, he couldn't help but notice how much attention Ella was attracting. It was as if two forces, a white deer and a golden lion, had come together in this dance, and their unusual pairing was both beautiful and unforgettable. All eyes were on them. Rosalind had already entered the banquet hall. She felt out of place among so many guests, but she couldn't help noticing how everything changed when Ella appeared on stage, and then they met, the main characters of this story. Rosalind felt that her efforts had finally paid off. She was even happy for them, but somehow she noticed that her joy quickly turned into a restlessness she couldn't explain. It was good that they had met, but it didn't help to dispel the strange feeling inside her. Rosalind stood aside, watching the lavish banquet. She had already fulfilled her role by bringing Kahir and Ella together, and although the plot had returned to its original course, a feeling of slight sadness overwhelmed her. She had helped the heroes find each other, but now that her part in the story was over, she couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness. All those years of fighting for her life and for the chance to see the main characters meet seemed pointless. Now that Ella and Kahir had finally met, she felt like an outsider. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind her. Derek told her that Kahir was looking for her. Rosalind, sensing that the dance was about to begin, smiled. She noted that the Emperor had already found his perfect partner, so he would soon forget about her. Derek didn't believe her. For him, Rosalind was the only perfect partner for the Emperor. He understood that Kahir, although he did not show it outwardly, had been impatient for a long time. Derek felt that if he did not find Rosalind quickly, it could lead to unpredictable consequences. When the secretary pointed to Kahir, the advisor looked in the direction she indicated. Ella was standing in front of the Emperor. The scene looked unusual. Despite their cold appearance, there was a certain tension in the air. The music for the first dance grew louder, and the guests began to look for their partners. Rosalind, realizing that her presence here no longer made sense, nudged Derek. She let him know that he should dance and asked him to find Hui. The question of whether she should be happy for Kahira and Ella was spinning in her head. She had helped them meet. Now she could watch them dance together just as she had intended. But inside, she felt that something was wrong. She was still on the sidelines watching others create their own stories. Rosalind remained just a part of someone else's world. She had fought long and hard for her place in this world, but now that the main characters had been found, was she just surplus to requirements? As she pondered this, the secretary suddenly heard a familiar voice break through the music. Her gaze shifted sharply, and there was the Emperor again. He stepped out of the crowd, leaving Ella behind. She didn't understand why he was approaching her. Perhaps he had no intention of leaving her alone. He asked her what she was doing there, but his voice was noticeably irritated. Kakir, assessing the situation in the hall, felt that the dance would not end until he decided what to do with Rosalind. His attention shifted back to Derek, who was already standing with Hui, ready to dance. Seeing this, the Emperor decided that Rosalind had to agree to dance. His patience was running out. Kahir reached out his hand to Rosalind. His smile was calm and his expression relaxed. He looked calm and confident. Rosalind paused for a moment, hesitating. She felt her heart tighten, and although doubts remained in her mind, she agreed. Accordingly, their hands met, and the dance began. It seemed that Kahir danced much better than one might have expected. His movements were confident and smooth. Even Rosalind, with no experience, was able to feel the rhythm. Her body obeyed, and with each turn she became more confident. Hui watched the couple dancing on the main stage with fascination. The girl's eyes sparkled with admiration as she looked at Kahir and Rosalind, as if she saw something real, unusual, and important. All eyes were on the couple. They silently watched them, captivated by their grace and natural harmony. One of the guests thought they were a truly perfect couple. Another, unable to contain her curiosity, asked excitedly who the girl was. Azel, watching from the throne, realized that what was happening before her eyes defied logic. She couldn't believe that the Emperor had chosen Rosalind as his partner. Anger and dissatisfaction overwhelmed her when she realized who was taking that place. Trying to hide her concern, Azel cautiously pointed out that Kahir, although shy, would change over time. She turned to Ella, trying to give the impression that everything was going according to plan. She even said that her eyes never lied, and that Ella was the perfect match for Kahir. However, Ella, though she tried to control herself, could not hide her indignation. Her thoughts were filled with disappointment and incomprehension. She clutched her dress and bit her lip. She felt all her hopes that she and the Emperor would fall in love at first sight melting away before her eyes. Now, as Rosalind and Kahir danced together, she couldn't understand why everything was happening this way. Rosalind couldn't help but exclaim as she watched the Emperor's movements with admiration. She blushed slightly, captivated by how flawlessly he held her. Kahir's response was slightly playful. He didn't stop, maintaining his confidence and control, even when Rosalind asked if he had practiced. Her question led to an unusual response, even though she meant it out of ordinary curiosity. The music grew faster, and the couple moved together, pressing closer and closer to each other. This increased the tension in the air. For Azella, watching this scene was difficult. She felt her patience running out. All these years, Rosalind had always ruined her plans. And now, when everything was about to be decided, her presence was once again jeopardizing the future. Azel knew that if Ella Paulos took the throne, she would no longer be able to resist. It was Rosalind's first ball, her first dance, and she compared it unhappily to Kahir's experience. Her words were cautious but expressed her dissatisfaction. She felt a little confused, trying to keep up with his movements as she followed him. Kahir responded calmly, again not letting on that anything was bothering him. His breathing remained steady, and he held her as if it were a dance just for her. A few seconds of silence, and then he spoke again. He denied her words, explaining that it was actually his first dance that he had initiated. And although Rosalind couldn't help but feel how important this moment was, the melody slowly came to an end, and their partnership seemed to become important and unchanging. Rosalind was breathing heavily, feeling her heart still beating fast after the quick tempo of the music. The Emperor seemed satisfied while Rosalind tried to gather her strength. Her body was exhausted, and beads of sweat glistened on her forehead. She felt deeply tired, but she knew she couldn't rest yet. The ball could not and must not end until everything was done. She assured Kahir that everything was fine, even offering to send someone for him after the fireworks so he could rest. The Emperor had to remain by the Empress's side so that any rumors about their relationship would have no basis for development. It was important for the Empire. Rosalind was steadfast in her duties. Kahir, once again surprised by her determination, asked if she would stay, and she confirmed without hesitation. He decided to stay with her. At that moment, Rosalind felt that her place was still here. As they approached the exit, Rosalind suddenly stopped, catching someone's gaze. It was Ella. Rosalind's purple dress blossomed around her as she stopped, her gaze meeting Ella's. Kahir noticed that Rosalind had stopped and looked back. He immediately understood why she had stopped. Ella was behind her. She looked delicate and fragile, with a special look that made him want to protect her. The Emperor walked away, deciding he had duties to attend to in the hall, and instructed Rosalind to keep order. She assured him she could manage on her own, then gathered herself and left the banquet hall. She needed some fresh air to calm her mind. Rosalind sat on a bench by the fountain, enjoying the cool air that brought relief after the hot banquet. She leaned back a little, taking a deep breath to calm her nerves and regain her strength. The silence was broken by a voice, and Rosalind turned to see who had interrupted her. Ella stood before her, her hands clasped in front of her. Her face expressed some kind of vague pity. Rosalind couldn't help but wonder why Ella wasn't with the Emperor right now. Shouldn't she be there with him? But instead of showing her irritation, she smiled politely and greeted the girl. Only a slight cold breeze passed between them. Rosalind felt it bring with it a sense of silence and loneliness. Ella was still silent, and not waiting for a response, Rosalind headed for the banquet hall. But suddenly Ella grabbed her by the arm. The secretary looked at her. undisguised anxiety appearing in her eyes, and Ella, muttering quietly, asked if it was she who had organised all this. Rosalind felt a wave of anger and a desire to break free. She wondered if it would be another problem if she responded sharply. Ella's gaze became sharp and piercing. Rosalind asked if she had anything to say. The girl could no longer hold back her irritated look and said bluntly that it was all part of Rosalind's plan. Ella believed that she was the one who should be with Kahir, that she would become empress. Rosalind was surprised by these words, but tried not to show it. Ella declared that Rosalind was stuck to the emperor. The secretary tried to explain that their communication was just a misunderstanding. Then she asked why Ella allowed herself to be so arrogant. Her interlocutor, unable to hold back her smile, replied with noticeable ease, so that Rosalind would understand her role in this game. The situation became much more complicated when Ella promised to visit Rosalind the next day. She surprised her with her knowledge of the specific tea that the emperor liked.